Welcome back after your short afternoon break. I hope you managed to get away from the computer for a little bit and relax a little bit before we move on to our next session. So if you've ever been to a CALC Summer before, you will know very well my friend and colleague Michelle, who's going to be delivering the second session of today and is going to be talking to us about something that's very close to my practice right now, which is reading lists. So Michelle is going to be asking us, do we still need reading lists and reading list systems? So I will pass on to you, Michelle. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darren. This is just what I look like in case you haven't seen me before. I'm just going to stop my video and share my slides with you instead. So yeah, if you want to talk to me on Twitter, I'm libmichelle on Twitter. And yeah, this workshop is all about reading lists and reading list systems and querying whether they're still useful or a tool that we still need. So at some point in this, Darren is going to have to leave us, at which point I will be both the host and the presenter. So throughout most of this, I won't be able to keep up with the chat. But at the end of when I finish talking, we're going to take like a 5-minute break for you to ponder some questions, and then I will pick up what is in the chat. But hopefully everyone will be adhering to the code of conduct and polite to each other whilst I can't watch it. But yeah. So I'd like to start off this with a bit of a disclaimer as well, that this talk doesn't represent a position statement by my employer. It's a mix of some research that I've undertaken, my personal experiences, and as a subject librarian, and my opinion based on the research and experiences that I've had, so it doesn't necessarily reflect or represent what my library is actually doing in practice. The talk that I'm going to do also doesn't have a conclusion or any practical steps for you to take, as it's still a work or some thoughts in progress. Having said that, I'm really fully ready for someone to point out a really glaring error in my thinking. So, you know, if we get to the end of this and someone's like, but what about this that you haven't thought about, fully ready for that to happen. And I'd also like to say at this point that in querying reading lists and reading list systems, I'm not trying to diminish anyone's work around these. Much like with Ula's workshop, I think it's really necessary for us to be critical about systems that we use and challenge our assumptions about them. So with all of those disclaimers out of the way, this is the agenda. I'm going to talk for a little while around the following points. So suggested reading is messy and what's the point of a reading list system? And then I'm going to pose some questions for you to think about while I take a short break and check the chat. And then we're going to have time for a Q&A and for some discussion. So first of all, a little bit of background about why and how I got interested in reading lists for a start. So I've worked in libraries, in academic libraries for over a decade now, and I've been a subject librarian for almost all of that time. And over that time, I've always had to deal with reading list systems, and I found that they aren't questioned. They're just seen as something that we need to do or that we need to have in academic libraries. And a few years ago, I started thinking about the time and the effort that I put into reading lists and reading list systems and querying whether they're worth it. So a little bit similar to the guides, we put a lot of effort into reading list systems and people complying with reading list systems. And, you know, is this worth our time and the effort that we put into it? And these thoughts came from my observed perspective that reading lists were often being gamed. So if you're a subject librarian, you know what I mean by that. You know, we often tell academics, just stick it on the list and we'll be able to buy it for you, that kind of thing. that reading is recommended to students in a variety of different ways, and also that reading list systems are incredibly expensive and often quite difficult to use. So again, a little bit similar to LibGuides. I also thought there might be a disconnect between the official reading list that's on the reading list system and what materials students were being recommended in class. And so I eventually got some support to do some research into this and started looking at the literature around reading list systems. And this led me to wondering if we're asking the wrong questions about reading lists and reading list systems. Because what I found is that the literature around reading list systems largely focuses on undertaking surveys that question various groups like academics and students about systems that are already in place. So asking questions like, what do you like or what do you dislike about this system? And to me, this seemed to be asking the wrong question. And I think we're all aware of the issues with surveys and respondent bias. And the answers to the surveys were largely things that we were probably already aware of, like, it's not super user-friendly, or, I have to install a bookmarklet that is really, and that's like a real hurdle to me using the list, or those kinds of things. I also think these surveys came to the wrong conclusions. So I mentioned this to Ula, that we often think of the issues that need to be fixed around our systems as being to do with the users of those systems, so the academics of the students. And often when I read or hear about reading list systems, the conclusion is that the library somehow needs to do better in engaging academics or students to make them use the system. So things like raising awareness, changing perceptions, offering more training, those are the kinds of solutions that we often fall back on. And both the questions and the conclusions that come at reading list systems from the perspective that we need reading lists and reading list systems, they're givens, they're the status quo. They're seen as must-haves rather than tools that we can choose to use or not use. So in my research, I wanted to take a step back and think more broadly about reading and ask academic teaching staff what their processes are around communicating reading to students. And I did this via some semi-structured interviews that deliberately didn't mention reading lists or reading list systems unless they were brought up. And a bit of a spoiler, they often weren't. But what we did talk about really made me query whether reading lists and reading list systems are necessary, particularly in the way that they are currently used. So the following is a bit of a mashup of thoughts that are informed from the interviews that I did with academics, the literature review I undertook, and also my own experiences of being a subject librarian. So the first point I want to make is that suggested reading is messy. So as I said, I deliberately didn't ask academics about reading lists. My starter questions were around how they communicated or suggested reading to their students. And I started using this term suggested reading in my mind to encompass all of the reading that staff might give to students, rather than what is on an official list. So the term suggested reading for me encompasses all of the reading that academic staff might suggest to students in all of these different places, like on reading lists, via one-to-one conversations, on lecture slides, in module guides, etc., etc. And as you can see, that's pretty messy. So this is part of what I call the reading list non-adoption model, and it's got 3 parts. So the first is what we think is happening, and it's a fairly kind of linear process. So we tend to see this reading list process as fairly simple and probably transactional. If it's on a list, someone must be using it. So again, a bit like libguides, if we've put it on a libguide, someone must be using it, right? And the idea is sort of, it's this linear process of academics thinking up things for students to read. They add this item to an online reading list system. The library then buys the item, and then the students look at the list. They get items from the library and they're all very happy about it. And it's a great process, you know, in theory. You know, maybe that's working in some ways, but like I just said, I think suggested reading is a lot messier. So the second part of this model is what is actually happening. And what's happening is that suggested reading is actually found in a lot of different places. So on official lists, on unofficial lists, in module guides, which students don't really look at, on lecture slides, in conversations. And some of these we are able to pick up in the library. So we mostly hear about items on an online list and probably also a print list if we have the spare time to spend trawling the VLE. But these other things that, these other ways that reading is recommended to students, we probably don't know about. So yeah, I think with this in mind, I don't think it's surprising that the literature shows that there's a gap between staff and student expectations of reading lists. Students often think of reading lists as a definitive, when staff think of them as a starting point. And I think, again, calling back to Ula's workshop about libguides, you know, is that their mental model? Do students actually use these lists as a starting point for research? Because again, they are just lists. Students also often want consistency between lists and often see them as more important than staff do. Reading lists can also be seen as part of the hidden curriculum. They're often mandatory. Academics often create them and stick them in the module guide, but students don't necessarily know that they exist or where to find them. There's also a lack of guidance for students in reading lists. They're seen as, or have the potential to be, pedagogical tools, but are they used as such? And I think, you know, I talked again with Ula a little bit about this. I personally have 3 degrees and I've never once experienced a reading list being integrated into our learning or into the classroom. So I'm a bit skeptical about the idea of reading lists being a pedagogical tool. And, you know, probably not all academics, I'm sure there is some good practice around reading lists, but they're often just some kind of static list somewhere that may or may not have been updated recently. I also found that most suggestions for new reading material are sent to the library via email, usually directly to the subject librarian, which calls into question reading list systems and their point in this whole process. We buy things that are on reading lists and things that are sent via email as well. So if we conclude that not all reading is on a list, lists often aren't used, that there's an expectation gap between staff expectations and student expectations, and that suggestions for reading are often sent to the library via email, the next logical question for me is, what is the point of a reading list system? So this question sort of sent me into the spiral of doom, and you will be glad to know I won't pause too long on this slide, and please don't look at it too closely. It started me thinking, this line of thinking started me thinking about how messy reading is, and querying reading list systems had me asking questions like, if staff don't update lists and students don't look at them, why are we buying this stuff? What are we missing out on? Why are we wasting our time chasing reading lists when they're not the only or main source of reading? And what if everything we stock in our libraries is total junk that no one wants to use? And at the end of this spiral, I kind of concluded that someone would hopefully have noticed by now if we were stocking our libraries with junk, since reading list systems massively predate me working in academic libraries. And so that's my tiny glimmer of hope at the end of the spiral, I guess, is that hopefully someone has noticed if this is a real problem by now. The spiral of doom did highlight a real issue for me though, and that's that we now often have collections policies that are based around buying things on reading lists. And I think particularly in libraries with small budgets, this might be really problematic, given what I've already highlighted about suggested reading. In my experience as well, there's a list which is used to check the institutional mandate box, and it's not necessarily the same as what's used in class. So there's a discrepancy there. To create a module in the module creation process, an initial list is often given, which will necessarily change as the module is developed and approved, and then goes into be taught. But the list that was originally given might be forgotten or not updated. And if the library is working from that initial list and it doesn't match the list that's actually being used in the taught class, that's a real issue. It means that the library can't buy what's current and actually being used. And the point of the making reading lists an integral part of collections policies, the justification for that is usually that the library wants to buy what is being taught at the university or what is being used to teach at the university. And, if reading lists aren't being updated or they're out of date, etc., then that really doesn't work as a collections policy. And there's also an issue with diversifying collections. And one of my research findings was that academics come across reading in lots of different ways, including using what they were taught when they learned their subject. And so this replication of materials is probably a contributing factor to the continued predominance of white Western materials on reading lists. And I think there's been a fair amount of research sort of analysing reading lists and finding that it is very biased towards white Western texts. The good news though there, I guess, is that they also get reading through lots of other channels, like their own CPD, discussion with colleagues, going to conferences, visiting bookstores, etc. So I guess there is potential for change, although that also is problematic in a bunch of different ways as well. Okay, so moving on to thinking about the question of what is the point of a reading list system. So in my interviews with academics, my library's reading list system only came up with one participant who was a pretty enthusiastic user. And I think I got to interview that person because the way I recruited participants was by asking my colleagues in my subject librarian team to get in touch with friendly academics that they knew and ask them to participate in my research. And I think perhaps some of them misunderstood that as I wanted to talk to enthusiastic users of our reading list system. So maybe that was an error in my communication. But it was kind of nice to talk to someone that was interested and enthusiastic about the reading list system, because that kind of gave me a counterpoint to the other interviews that I did, and also, you know, my perspective, which is being a reading list skeptic. So the majority of my other interviewees either didn't mention the reading list system, or if they did mention it, they said they found it difficult to use, and nobody, I think, came up with the name of our system off the top of their head. They were sort of like, oh yeah, we've got that system, but they couldn't remember what it was called. And this really chimes with my experience as a subject librarian, including one memorable school meeting that I attended where I was shouted at about how awful the system was to use. And I genuinely don't know what that academic thought I was going to be able to do about the user experience of, of this particular reading list system. But yeah, I think, yeah, my experience is, and maybe there's some confirmation bias in here, is that people don't necessarily like to use the reading list system. I'd like to acknowledge here as well that I think reading list systems are potentially useful as a library tool, and that there's nothing wrong with that. So again, you know, similar to the guides, I'm not anti things that make our jobs easier. But I think the focus of research into reading the systems, and also the salespeople from these systems, is on the benefit to academics and students. So we're being sold reading list systems as a tool to make life easier for our users rather than for the library. So they use language like, you know, all of your lists in one place and user-friendly interface, etc. As I've already talked about though, suggested reading is really messy, and it can't all be found in one place, calling into question the use of expensive systems that people don't really find user-friendly. So this is the third part of my reading list non-adoption model. So my thinking about reading list systems led me to create this diagram, the reading list compliance cycle, which if you follow me on Twitter, you've probably already seen because I tweeted about it sometime last year, I think. And it traces what I observe as the usual cycle of reading list systems, from acquisition or tender through to failure of engagement or low take-up of the system. So it starts at the top with, you know, the library gets approval and wants to get an online reading list system, or they tender for a new system, or they decide to relaunch a system that they already have. Academics are told about the system and asked to create their lists on it. Take up of this is generally really low, so maybe the library starts creating lists for academics. The library then realizes that this isn't sustainable. You know, we don't have enough people to go creating lists for everyone in the university. So they probably go to university management to get the creation and update of lists mandated. So, you know, there's now a university-wide mandate that all academics must have a reading list on the reading list system. And this leads to lots of time spent by library staff, usually your subject librarians, engaging with academics to try and get them to use the system, doing those kind of promotional activities, engagement activities, to try and get them to use the system. And then we go back to the start of the cycle where, you know, probably the reading list system contract ends and we go, okay, what are we going to do next? We haven't had much use from this. Maybe we need to do a relaunch, or maybe if we switch to one of the other systems, that would be a better experience. So yeah, that is my thoughts about the compliance cycle, and yeah, I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on that as well. I attended a talk recently where one of the findings, they were talking about a re-implementation of their reading list system. I think. And one of the findings was that students differentiate between library reading lists and tutor reading lists. The ones that were on the reading list system were somehow seen as like library reading lists and less official than ones provided elsewhere. And the conclusion to this was that the lists on the system should be seen as a tutor thing, not a library-driven exercise, which I found really interesting, like the most interesting point of their research and their talk, even though it was sort of mentioned in passing, because I just thought that's really indicative of what students are thinking. And if the point of your reading list system is to serve academics and users, if they think of that reading list as something that the library has created, or that the library, it's sort of library owned, then that isn't a good thing, is it? It's sort of positioning it as outside of their norm and outside of what they want and need. Yeah, and I might be sort of inferring too much perhaps from this thing that was casually mentioned in this talk, but yeah, maybe I'll follow up with the person that talked about it and see if I can find out more about that. I just thought that was super interesting. Anyway, so I take issue with the term compliance as well. So we often talk about getting academics to comply with reading list systems, or how can we get people to do this? And I think that really takes the humanity out of a lot of our university processes. And we've become such complex institutions that it's really impossible for academic staff to comply with all of the things that they're supposed to comply with. And I speak from experience here. I have been leading a module for the past few years, and it is absolutely impossible to try and find out even some really basic processes. Like, I've been really struggling this year to figure out which of the students are eligible for more resits, or eligible for more attempts at their assignment, which, you know, you should think would be a really easy thing to do. And it's absolutely impossible to find out. So I have to email constantly this poor person in our registry department and say, what about this student? Do you, you know, did they have another attempt or not? And, you know, bearing in mind that that is really kind of an essential part of university, is students being able to pass or not pass the module, academics being, or module leaders being able to know which students have passed that module and which ones have other attempts. I'm really not surprised that updating reading lists on our system is so far down their priority lists. You know, their workload is so high. They've got a lot of bureaucracy to battle with, and some of them, you know, write their lectures the night before they're delivered as well. So, you know, they probably don't even know until the last minute what is going to be on a reading list. And it seems to me that academic workload and precarity is also a factor in why interventions, like also known as engagement or promotion activities, seem to only have a short-term effect. Academics are incredibly busy, and staff turnover can also be really high. So I absolutely don't blame them for not engaging with yet another system. At that engagement point of the cycle, we often do the kinds of surveys that I mentioned earlier as well. So asking what they like about the system or what they don't like, with the aim of fixing sort of any issues that come up. And as I've sort of mentioned before, I don't really think that that sort of shifts the responsibility for the system onto the user, rather than us querying and thinking about whether or not that system is fit for purpose and is fit for the use that or the gap that it's trying to fill. I also think that libraries instituting blanket policies like everyone must have a reading list on our system is really bad practice, as it misses nuances and creates an extra burden for everyone. So I'm currently librarian for media and also engineering, and the kind of reading that they will do in media subjects even it varies amongst them. So we've got a couple of production courses and then one theory course, and the production courses don't really necessarily do a lot of reading in the way that we would think about it and put it on a reading list system, whereas the theory course has a lot more reading. And then if you think about like aerospace engineering, for example, which is one of the courses I support, again, it's a very practical kind of course. They don't really do a lot of reading. So saying to everyone, you've got to have a reading list when, they might not even have a reading list for a module is, I think, not a good idea, I guess. Just a bad practice that creates this extra burden. And so rather than forcing compliance with a system that only a small percentage of people might like, I suggest that we maybe need to figure out better ways of fitting into the workflows so that academics tell us about the reading that their students need. And as I've said before, the kind of most common way that academics communicate that to us is via email, usually to their subject librarian, or perhaps, in a conversation. So again, querying whether or not reading list systems are filling the gap that they think they are. Back to the literature review, what I've observed from it when literature talks about reading list system implementations and overhauls, again, the conclusion is often some kind of deficit in academics and students that the library needs to overcome with engagement or promotional activities. And I think if you've heard a pitch from any of the companies that supply reading list systems, this will be a part of it, that to ensure or increase take-up of the system, library staff need to work on promotion and engagement. But I'd like to suggest here that perhaps it's the system that's the problem and not the people who are trying to use it. And by that, I don't mean just the reading list software. I mean the whole concept of reading lists. I mean that the way that reading is communicated to students and to the library. I mean the whole thing. So to wrap up, I'll remind you that I said at the beginning that I wouldn't be offering solutions, but I do think that I've raised a number of questions and issues to grapple with. And hopefully nobody in the chat has already pointed out the glaring omission that I have undoubtedly made in this talk. But first of all, spirals of doom probably aren't really helpful, as they lead to you thinking far too much about reading the systems and asking panicked questions of your colleagues. So yeah, don't recommend you go into a spiral of doom about anything to do with libraries. I do think that accepting suggested reading is messy, and talking about it as such, though, will be beneficial to everyone, and perhaps open up a conversation about the necessity of reading lists. And I also think perhaps we've been asking the wrong questions about reading lists and reading list systems, and we should refocus on how we can accurately and effectively capture reading for the library to ensure that it's available and to communicate it to students to close that expectation gap that I talked about. Along with this, I think comes the question of whether the time and money put into reading list systems is worth it, and whether this could better be spent elsewhere. Okay, so that's my collection of thoughts around this topic. So on this next slide, I have 5 questions to prompt discussion. And I'd like to give you 5 minutes to think about them and think about my talk while I stop talking and check the chat for any questions and the comments. So I'm going to turn off my microphone for 5 minutes until 4:10 to do that checking, and then we will come back and have a discussion about what I've said and about these prompts as well. So back at 4:10. Okay, great. I've had 5 minutes to read the chat, and thank you, everyone. I am extremely relieved that nobody was like, but Michelle, this is one major thing that you haven't thought about. So yes, I was very fearful of that happening. So thank you so much. And there's lots of great messages saying that, you know, what I've sort of said has resonated, and you know, lots of different ways that the reading list systems work or don't work. Yeah, someone said it can be a bit of a problem when reading list systems are seen as the library system, and therefore people don't feel like they need to engage as much. Yeah, absolutely. I think where I work, one of the problems that we have is that we are such a big institution. There's something like 27,000 students at the main university, and then we've got like a bunch of subsidiaries and overseas campuses and all kinds of stuff. It's kind of proliferated so quickly. It's really the growth of the institution, I think, has outpaced its ability to what am I trying to say here? So I guess it's the growth of the institution has outpaced the ability of staff, I guess, to keep up in some ways. So like we've got so many different systems that it's sort of impossible. And you know, we went through this process where we were talking about switching systems, and I was like, oof, you know, we absolutely should not do that, because you know, we just had a new VLE last year. If we then ask academics to try and learn a new reading list system, they will riot for good reasons. And, you know, that wasn't, you know, the deciding factor necessarily in a tender process or anything like that. But I think, you know, that's one of the things we should think about. Okay, so does anyone want to, and you're very, very free to unmute yourselves as well. I am trying to keep up with the chat. But does anyone want to challenge or defend reading list systems? Particularly, I'd be particularly interested if anyone wants to defend reading list systems and tell me I'm wrong, or, you know, if there are any points that you'd like to make that I didn't make.
Michelle, I've unmuted. Am I all right to verbally speak rather than type it out?
Yeah, go for it, Maria.
Brilliant. Hello.
Hi.
So one of the things I find the reading list useful for, and I think it sort of links in with a couple of the points that you've put on the screen there, is as a useful starting point, especially for students who are quite nervous about what they should be reading, where to go. They're not very familiar with, you know, library catalogues or systems or even academic sources. And I know students have sort of said, oh, I like it, you know, having at least somewhere I can get started. But I think it's really important that we also stress that that's, for me, that is the main purpose of them, a place to get started, and it's not just the exhaustive only place to go. And thinking about when we're sort of teaching students about where to go to find resources, that we position reading lists alongside other ways of finding information and linking in with things like lecture slides, Moodle, whatever your VLE is, and also independent research, and really getting students to see more holistically how reading lists fit in with them. But I think one thing that's been useful for us is with having a system is consistency. And there in my school that there's actually quite a high take up of modules having reading lists on the sort of official system, if you will, and very few that don't. And I get constant emails from students on the modules that don't have reading lists to our reading list system asking me where they can find the reading list, because it's not in an easy link on the Moodle page like all the others are. They have to dig for it. It's often not in the same place. So from a consistency and ease of use for students finding the list, I think the system is helpful. And then the other thing that, you know, I think is a positive, our reading list system is linked to Alma. So we manage the back end of the reading list through the Alma system. And one thing that we get is notifications where links are broken. So say somebody's put, I don't know, a website on their reading list and the URL gets removed, we get an automatic notification, and anybody in the library can then fix that. Whereas if an academic had a paper list or Word document online and the link got broken, nobody would know until a student realizes the problem, reports it, then it gets resolved. So we're being a bit more proactive than reactive with certain issues that can happen.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'll just respond to a couple of those points you made. One is that I think when I was thinking about this and also preparing this talk, I was wondering how much of what I was thinking is specific to my particular institution. And me and Maria actually used to work together, so she knows better than a lot of you will what it's like to work at the place that I work. And so, yeah, it is interesting to see different universities and how they sort of deal with reading lists and hear about, you know, how people respond to them in different places. I think the other thing that I wanted to say as well was about when you were talking about sort of embedding reading lists and talking to students about them in library sessions. Yeah, I absolutely think that's valid, and talking to them about, you know, it's maybe one source and place to look, and there's also other sources. But I mean, often library sessions are but one session a year, potentially at the start of term. And I think where reading lists, if reading lists are to be successful, then they really need to be fully integrated into modules. And I think that's where they fall down. And I think there are some academics that do this, and, you know, they're like, okay, next week we're going to read this, or, you know, have a look at the reading list for next week's reading. And, you know, they put in work to it, they annotate it, they tell students why to read things, they tell them which bits to read, all of those kinds of things. And I think that's really helpful. But I don't think it's necessarily helpful if it is just sort of a list that's sitting somewhere. That maybe they mention at the start of term, or, you know, maybe they say to students to read the module guide, because students often don't know what a module guide is to start off with, or again, maybe that's very specific to where I work. But yeah, I think it's in that, when I talked about it being a pedagogical tool, that was sort of what I meant, is that, you know, if it's actually embedded and used, I think reading lists can be a good tool. But I don't think a lot of the time that is what is happening in practice. Darren, I think you had your hand up.
I did, yes. I'll just check nobody else did first. You gave an invite to argue with you, so I immediately put my hand up to do that. I think this isn't so much a defense of reading lists, but I think it's another consideration that I would bring in as well. The part of the move towards relying purely on reading list systems for purchasing a lot of books and developing collections, I think it's also really linked to the way that we choose to staff our libraries as well, because fundamentally, if we ask academics to create basically a shopping list of all the items we want that's sent to the library, that can be purchased by staff that are on lower grades, that are not paid as much, and are just basically cheaper than it is to have librarians who are actively engaging with their academics to find out what's going on in their course areas, to actually proactively manage the collection. So I think that's another factor that sort of comes into this, is that it's about, you know, as with anything, capitalism is the problem, and it's a cheap way of doing things, but actually it just pushes the labour elsewhere, I think.
I thought you were going to argue with me.
I was. I think I started arguing. Yeah, I started arguing with you and then turned it around and yeah, agree with you. But I guess if we're going to move away from reading list systems, then we need to look at the staffing that we have, because I think a lot of subject librarians are just managing far too broad a portfolio of courses to be able to do anything otherwise, really.
Yeah, agreed.
So it's a sort of a defence for the wrong reason, I guess.
Thank you. Anyone else got their hands up? I haven't seen. Oh, Chantel.
Hi. Yeah, firstly, I just wanted to say thank you for raising so many of these points, because as the reading list coordinator for my institution, I have to walk a very fine line of trying to draw attention to some of these issues while not also trying to jeopardize my own post. So it feels like nice to have these conversations without it feeling like I'm just going a bit bonkers. But yeah, we have so many of these problems in my institution. We don't have a mandate. So it really is about sort of trying to have conversations with academics and persuading them that there is sufficient value in using a reading list. And we've certainly been trying very hard to make it more about what is the value of the reading list for the academic rather than the value of it for us as a library. So that kind of means that we can't, we could take the reading lists and create them for the academics, although we definitely don't have the staffing for that. But, I sort of flag with them that it's their expertise and their kind of annotations and signposting and questions and things that they can integrate into reading lists that really give the lists the value. But we will accept acquisitions requests either from reading lists or just by academics emailing the acquisitions team and just saying, I want X number of copies of this title. And it's a big kind of target for the library to move from that email system to doing all of our purchasing via reading lists, which, as I have pointed out, without a mandate is impossible. And, it's kind of interesting to reflect on what you've been saying and think, well, is it really ideal? Is that what we really want? If people are using the system where they email and ask for things to be purchased and people are happy with that, is there really that much benefit to kind of forcing them to use a reading list system that maybe they don't want to use or they don't have time to use or isn't applicable to their subject area, just for our kind of acquisitions purposes? Although I do think there are some benefits in terms of like being able to see, across modules what is needed, and getting a sense, a more holistic sense of the material that's needed for the university. I think that was just a big ramble, but
no, that's totally fine. And I'm also really glad that you identified yourself as a reading list coordinator, because I had this horrible fear that like loads of people in reading list jobs were going to turn up with pitchforks and like try and take me down for like suggesting that perhaps reading lists shouldn't be a thing. But yeah, I think yeah, absolutely, as Darren just put in the chat, yay to rambles on topics we don't usually talk about. And like, I'm really glad that this has sort of prompted that thinking and sort of also chimes with your experience as well. And you sort of recognized your experiences and what I was talking about. And yeah, I think often what drives those decisions around moving to a system that's not just email based is the money, isn't it? We've spent so much money on whatever system it is that we've got to find a way to show its value. And if you have to have good take up of reading lists and lots of reading lists on your system to show that value, right? And you've got to have people engaging with them. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right in querying, if it's a system that works, if academics just emailing you is a system that works and it has been working, why should you switch to trying to force them into using yet another system that's actually, can be quite difficult to for them to use? And I think I saw in the chat a few people were saying about, they only generally need to use it once a year. So that makes it even more difficult, like any system, you know, that you only have to use once a year, you're kind of like, and you probably put it off for ages because you're like, oh, that's going to be really difficult and I don't remember my password and all of those kinds of things. So yeah, I think more of us probably need to ask that question of whether or not we should be changing those processes. So thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I don't think anyone else has got their hand up at the moment. Darren, were there any questions in the chat?
None that I've seen. I mean, there's a really active discussion in the chat and just various garbage that I'm posting, my own particular thoughts. I don't think I've seen any questions.
Brilliant. Does anyone have any kind of other responses to my question prompts that I've put here? Particularly this one about what's the point of a reading list system? Or any suggestions for how we might do better?
I think on that question, Michelle, about what we might do better, it does seem that there's a fair number of people that are in the chat that have sort of said that, you know, they will do reading lists for people so that, you know, the academic can collect resources in the way that they used to, which is to collect, you know, a bibliography or reference list, pass that on to the librarian, and then they will take care of the list for them, which I guess might be a better way for certainly some academics and possibly even a more efficient way. I'm thinking that that's what I used to do as a subject librarian a lot.
Yeah, I think this is why I said what I said about blanket policies, because what I'm sort of advocating for in my library at the moment is that we don't have a blanket policy. We actually find out, you know, what's happening from each individual librarian and then shape processes around that. So, you know, if you've got a school and a librarian where, you know, they have great uptake, you know, you can work with that. But if you've got another school where there's low uptake and all of their academics just send you a list via email, you know, you can work on a different process for that as well. And, you know, those processes are all okay because they suit that particular context, I guess. So, you know, that's why I don't particularly like blanket policies. Sorry, Chris has got their hand up.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's just a comment really. And, you know, I've really enjoyed the talks today. They've been very stimulating, but it's the disconnect that I think you get when you've got the systems driving library processes that bear no relation to what the sort of timetable and work of the academics are, you know. So, you know, invariably at my institution, we send out the email, give us your reading list by the end of July, and we will be able to process it. You know, what's it if you submit beginning of August? We've got no guarantee, but this is, you know, coming through. The timetable is totally wrong because some departments don't know what they're teaching. Sometimes they haven't appointed, you know, teaching fellows they don't even appoint, you know, so to the end of September. And then we expect them to come with a fully fledged list. Well, by that time, we've got a major sort of backlog to sort of process. So the academics then bypass the whole reading list system because they're too late. Or, you know, it could be that they've been off with work-related stress, they're coming back, they see all these messages relating to July where they didn't know what they were teaching. And I just think it's how the library is positioned. And I think what you were saying about having more flexibility in it, you know, so some of the departments I work with, they don't assign teaching until the end of July. So how can they get a reading list in when they don't know that they're responsible for it? And I think the library just seems incredibly rigid and totally, you know, like in the previous speaker, there's this sort of gap. I'm sort of losing the track of my thread now, but it's the disconnect between what academics are doing and this whole library system that we're expected to populate. So you end up with, I came across a very interesting sort of chat between two academics on Facebook going on about sort of the library doesn't input anymore onto, we're on Tallis. They've sort of farmed it out to the academics to do. And I just sort of think, well, we've ended up maintaining two loads of reading lists. You've got the reading list on the ground broken into Moodle, into chunks that work with students because they can be, inserted into teaching material along with lecture PowerPoints. And then you've got this massive list sort of stuck in Tallis, maybe sort of related to an academic that taught it in a previous year. And we're trying to work out, is the Tallis list, current or not? Should we roll over a draft and publish it or not in order to keep the statistics high on the Tallis engagement? You just, I don't know, you're maintaining two systems. You're looking at what's actually happening on the ground and what's actually happening on this sort of legacy, sort of Tallis Aspire system. So that was just a vent. I don't know if it made any sense at all, but
yeah, no, it absolutely did, and we've had a bunch of people chiming in the chat. It absolutely makes sense. I completely agree. I think we're coming in at the wrong point in their workflows, or trying to come in at the wrong point. I think at my institution in particular, it's also complicated by we have the end of the financial year at the end of July. So we're trying to desperately spend some money before the end of July, because we always end up in with a bit of a surplus or get given some extra money. So we're like, oh, can you send us some more reading, or what do you need for next year? And obviously they don't know. And then we've got our start of term has become so early in September as well, that basically academics are coming back in September, because we all know they pretty much disappear for most of the summer, if not all, just all of August. And then we don't have a freshers week or anything anymore as well. So it's jumping straight into teaching. So it's like, at what point there can we make sure as a library we get the stuff? And it's not so much of an issue, I guess, with ebooks, but with print texts, the lead time on them, it's all of those kinds of things. But okay. I've just realised we are starting to run over time. Darren, was that what you were going to yell at me about?
No, I think we're...
Or you just muted yourself?
I think we've got about 10 minutes left by the looks of it.
Okay. Yeah, that was, I think 4:30 was the end of my talk, I think, but we had like an extra bit, so we can carry on talking.
Yes, we've got you down till 4:45. So.
Okay.
I was just going to add in just a little bit around my experience in my institution. We actually probably have one of the highest uptakes of reading list adoption in the sector, really, because creating and publishing a reading list is part of the module approval process. So you have to have created a reading list on the reading list system in order to have your module validated. So basically we have about 85% to 90% uptake of that. And only a few ever get through without it. But what our experience then is great in terms of getting that overall number up, but the quality of the lists are absolutely appalling, because they've been written at validation stage and they're not at all responsive to what the module is going to be. And the big problem then is you're pointing at a list and buying stuff that's totally out of date. Often if it's, say, a new program, it could be a third-year module, and we bought all the text for it 3 years before that module was going to run, and then rebuy any new editions that come out afterwards. And it's become a real challenge now also to improve those lists, because it's almost easier to start from scratch than it is to redo a list which was made at validation stage. So yeah, it's really problematic here as well, even without that low you know, with having a high uptake of lists, it just creates a whole new problem almost for us.
Yeah.
Just wondering if anyone else was in the same sort of situation that has that common mandate in place.
I'm just scrolling back through the chat and I saw someone asked a question. Do you think that without a reading list system, you would actually hear about all the things that are needed by students? Yeah, so I'll go back to what I said at the start of my talk, which is that I don't have any solutions here. I don't have the magic answer. And if I did, I probably wouldn't be giving it away in a free talk. I would probably set up my own consultancy and, you know, go full capitalist and make all my millions from you. But I think we potentially, and I'd be interested to hear from people that don't have reading list systems, but I think we would still hear about quite a lot of stuff. I still don't think we would hear about, you know, stuff on lecture slides or, you know, stuff that academics tell students in person. And I'm thinking particularly of like dissertation meetings here, where they will have a discussion about sources and stuff and maybe suggest a book or two, maybe pull a book off their shelves, those kinds of things. But I think, you know, reliant on relationships, you would still probably hear about most, if not everything. And I guess that's where it comes into play that you have library staff that have good relationships with academics. And I think for me, trying to promote a system or trying to make academics use a system that they really dislike, I found quite damaging to relationships. Whereas I think if you are able to go to academics and say, you know, we want to know what you're suggesting to students, you know, just shoot me an email or whatever, or, you know, do you mind if I just go into your module space and just grab something from there? Do you upload a list or whatever? I think if we're positioning it as making their lives easier, and hopefully, like Chris was talking about, doing it at the right time of year, trying to figure out that point in the year where that would actually be a helpful thing to do and a helpful thing to talk to them about as well. I think, you know, it would still work. And I genuinely think as well, like, the reading list systems cost so much money that the savings from those systems could be put into, say, staff, for example, and staff supporting those processes. So, you know, your academic librarian, liaison librarians, subject librarians, whatever you call them, probably don't have time to dig around in VLEs and, you know, create lists from scratch. But your library assistants, you know, you can create some posts where that could happen and get your subject librarians to do that liaison with the academics, and then pass on those lists. And actually, this is what's happening in reality anyway. So I talked about currently at the moment, I'm trying to advocate for not having a blanket reading list policy, but figuring out what is happening with each individual librarian and working with them on a process that works for them. And I say that because that is actually what is happening. Like, we have had a blanket reading list policy for quite some time, and that's that academics create their own lists on the system, and we're all supposed to go out and promote the system to academics on a regular basis and demand that they update their lists, etc., and then send them for review. But what is actually happening in reality is that they're emailing us, they're emailing to ask how to get to the system, they're emailing us just lists of stuff, all of these kinds of things. So yeah, I do still think we'd hear about stuff without a reading list system. Any other questions, or anyone else want to put their hand up and say anything? Doesn't look like we've had anything new in the chat, or nobody's put their hand up. So Darren, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, well, I think that's been a really great discussion. I've really enjoyed that, and it's been really nice to be able to. I think a lot of us are feeling like we've got a lot off our chests in that session, talking about reading lists and what our feelings and experiences have been. So I'd like us all to express our thanks, please, from Michelle for putting that together and for facilitating that session for us. So either in reactions or in the chat, if you could please express our thank you. We should start wrapping up and saying goodbye. So thank you very much for coming along to today's session. I hope you found plenty interesting in here. We have been recording the session as we go along. As I said at the start, we take recordings and we always manually caption them so that they are an accurate reflection of what has been said. So that does mean that it takes us a couple of weeks to get them up, because it's just me and Michelle to do that. When we do publish them, they'll go on our website, and we also put them on our YouTube channel. If you want to know, if you want to be the first to know when that video goes up, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Sorry, I'm just hearing myself in like a vlogger voice there. You can hit like, and you can subscribe to our channel, and you can see up there. And you can also see all the past sessions that we've had at CALC events previously, and check those out. We are looking at planning a third and final CALC Summer Series event, probably towards September time, early September, before the start of term for those of us who work in education. So do keep an eye out for that. And other than that, thank you all very much for coming along today. Thank you. I think have I said everything there, Michelle, that I'm supposed to say?
I think so, yeah.
Excellent, good.
Nice.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. And bye-bye. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.